Good evening. It's great to have you all here at the First Amendment Center. Tonight we're going to explore a new idea in politics. We have, as our first speaker, Elliot Ackerman, who is the Chief Operating Officer of something some of you never heard of, I'm sure, something called Americans Elect. New concept, new idea. It's caught on with many people across this country, perhaps because so many people are disenchanted with the state of politics in this country. Elliot is going to explain to you this program, and then we have a distinguished panel, and we're going to hear from that distinguished panel after Elliot finishes, and then we're going to entertain questions from the audience, and then we're going to exercise our First Amendment right to a free drink outside. Without further ado, welcome, Elliot. We're glad to have you here.
First of all, thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak to this group about Americans Elect and what we're doing. Essentially, what we're doing is this idea that we, as a country this cycle, could pick a president instead of a party. And so as we look around in 2011 going into 2012 and we see dissatisfaction manifest, whether it's in Occupy Wall Street, whether it's the challenges we face with our foreign policy, or if it's dissatisfaction manifested through the Tea Party movement. As we sit there with all of these challenges, the idea that 2012 is a change election seems to be right, just like we've seen many change elections in the past. But what if in 2012 the change wasn't necessarily a new person, but it was a new way of finding that person? And why is it with all of these challenges that we're sitting here with an increasingly narrowed field that on any given day looks something like this, where it's down to 3 or 4 individuals, and we're a little less than a year out from the election, and not a single vote has been cast. And the reason for that is basically the barriers to entry that exist in our political process, and as we're looking at Americans Elect this cycle, the presidential barrier, which is ballot access. It's extremely difficult to get on the ballot in all 50 states. It requires 2.9 million signatures nationwide and years of work. But what we're doing at Americans Elect is removing that barrier to entry, which is that 50-state ballot access, and that's happening right now. You can see as of today, we're circulating in 24 states. We're going to be on the ballot in 28 states plus D.C. by the end of the year. I can actually tell you, I see some folks I spoke with earlier today, that since we spoke, we're on the ballot in Colorado now. So this is happening right now. And in 2012, we're going to be on the ballot in all 50 states. There'll be a third ticket, which will be the Americans Elect ticket. What that allows us to do is basically reimagine the way we hold a presidential primary. And we're able to go from a field that potentially looks like this and is closed to one that becomes much more open in terms of possibilities. And as we do that, the question now then becomes, who will Americans ultimately elect? And what we'll see is a ticket like we've never seen before, which would be a nonpartisan ticket on the ballot in all 50 states. A Democrat with a Republican with an independent, or an independent with a Democrat. But really opening up our political space across the board. So we'll have a ballot that looks like this in November of 2012, and the American people will have more choice and a little bit more competition in their politics. So I mentioned this is happening right now, but could it actually happen? You know, we're going to discuss some polls. I know polls that have been done in the state of Tennessee. These are some that are done nationwide. If we look this cycle right now, we can see when the American people are asked, 81% of them say that they're dissatisfied with the way that they're being governed. If you look to 1992, the last time there was a real viable third ticket offered to the American people, obviously you can see that that number was 37%. Increasingly, when asked, 57% of Americans say that there's a need for a third party. And in a recent Washington Post ABC poll from a couple weeks ago, 61% of Americans said that they would like to see an independent candidate on the ballot. So we're able to reimagine that the way we hold a primary at Americans Elect. So what should that look like? Well, what we're doing is leveraging our technology to flatten the space, disintermediate it, and allow voters in. Any registered voter can sign up to be a delegate to the convention we're going to be hosting at americanselect.org. When they do that, they'll be able to learn about their priorities, answer questions on the substantive issues of the day. We've had 13 million questions answered to date. Additionally, they'll be able to pose questions to the candidates. We opened this feature a little over 3 weeks ago, and we've had 10,000 questions posed up until this point. And those will inform basically a platform of questions that every candidate will have to answer. Their positions will be their own, but they have to answer the questions that, that the delegates develop at Americans Elect. Oh, and you can see this is an example of one that's been posed, and they're pretty thoughtful questions. They're also able to learn about the candidates. You know, we're going to see candidates begin announcing through Americans Elect. Actually, you know, we're not opening that functionality until mid-December, but yesterday we had Buddy Roemer, former governor of Louisiana, announce that he intends to run through Americans Elect when that happens, and that's great. We anticipate that he will be one of many that want to compete for this 50-state ballot access. But in addition to candidates who announce, everyday Americans will be able to start and support draft movements for candidates at Americans Elect. And there's a long history of this in our country, all the way from General Wesley Clark to Colin Powell in 1996, all the way back to President Eisenhower's candidacy. These were all draft movements where everyday Americans pushed those individuals forward to serve. And you can see here, this is just a snapshot from our site of candidates and individuals of prominence as they're listed and as they fall out on the issues. So I mentioned this is happening right now. This is actually a little bit old. We're up to 2 million visitors as of today. 14 million Facebooks. This is also a little bit old. We're up to 400,000 Facebook fans. 300,000 plus delegates have come and signed up at americanselect.org to participate since the end of July. And we have 2,500 volunteers across the country, and we're on over 150 college campuses. And they're volunteers, like this is one of our volunteers in Utah delivering the signatures that got us on the ballot into Utah. This is also in Arkansas. Alice Skelton, one of our individuals who works in the field, working with one of our volunteers in the Secretary of State's office in Arkansas. And holding meetups around the country, just spreading the word about the idea behind Americans Elect and the possibility that it offers in our political system. And all of these people are rallying around the idea that in 2012, maybe we can pick a president instead of a party. So I've seen a lot of you who are interested. If anyone's interested in learning more and signing up, we have folks in the back who could speak with you, both Alice and Jenna. And aside from that, I welcome my fellow panelists and the discussion to follow.
Members of this panel. On the far left is John Geer, the chair of the Vanderbilt Department of Political Science. Next to him is Liz Zechmeister, associate director of Latin American Public Opinion Project. Next is Larry Bartels, professor of public and international affairs, and finally Josh Clinton, co-director with John Geer of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions at Vanderbilt. I'm going to be a moderator, which means I will say very little after I sit down. I'll try to be moderate, and most of what I say, moderators are supposed to be. And so, Josh, shall we begin with you, and then move to your left?
Sure. So I'm Josh Clinton, and I'm affiliated with the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions here at Vanderbilt. And so one thing that we do is we do a kind of a poll twice a year to kind of gauge the opinions of what Tennesseans think about various activities. And so we knew America's Elect was coming to town. And so as part of our poll, we started asking Tennesseans what they thought about the possibility of a third candidate and how that would change their views. Now, of course, we realize that we're asking them hypothetical matchups for election that's still a long ways away, and they have none of the background that's associated with America's Elect or any of the kind of context that's going on. But still, nonetheless, we've figured out it would be interesting to know just kind of what the baseline support is for the potential third-party candidate. And so we were in the field with a survey, and so a neat thing you can do with surveys is you can conduct basically experiments, right? And so how you ask questions or the responses that you give to respondents can really dramatically change how people think about the question. So one thing we did, for example, so we asked a series of hypothetical matchups by putting the sample in basically half. And so one sample, half of the sample, we asked, if the election were held today and the candidates were, the President Barack Obama and kind of Mitt Romney, and we also asked questions about kind of Herman Cain or kind of Governor Rick Perry, kind of who would you vote for, right? Just kind of the straight up matchup that you hear talked about all the time, endlessly on the press coverage. And so we basically figured out so we got the responses of that half the sample, but then we also asked another half of the sample kind of randomly. We gave them the response option that they could choose a qualified independent candidate, right? So it was intentionally vague. We let them kind of fill in the blanks as to whatever they thought that meant in their own head to kind of compare what the results would be. And again, there's no context about America's Elect or kind of how this qualified independent would come about in the process. And the results were interesting. So if you think about the results of Tennesseans, right, if you ask them without the third-party candidate, 38% of Tennesseans, and kind of, again, this is citizens, not registered voters, so what it actually would be a little bit different. But just if you ask the citizens of Tennessee what they would think, 38% of people would support kind of Obama, 42% would support Romney. So that's without the option to kind of select a qualified independent. You introduce that category for their opportunity, and the results change pretty dramatically. In particular, what you see is that Obama's support is pretty relatively fixed, right? So under the new condition, about 36% would still support Obama. But what happens is Romney's support basically craters. So it goes from 42% to 25%, and the support for the third-party candidate, a qualified independent, would basically be about 23%. Right? And so why is that the case? Well, who knows what the voters are actually thinking. I mean, it's possible that Democrats have an experience with a third-party candidate in Ralph Nader, and so they're a little reluctant to do that. And so maybe Republicans, if they thought about the overall aggregate effect, would kind of behave differently. But nonetheless, it's kind of interesting that even without any kind of a context about where this candidate may come from, there's a lot of kind of dissatisfaction among people who are potentially unhappy with the status quo in terms of who the candidates would be that they were supporting. And so, of course, there's a lot of ambiguity, right? A qualified independent is going to mean dramatically different things to different people. And so we just kind of hypothetically asked another kind of experiment, and we just kind of chose 3 names. Some of them are more plausible than the others. So we looked at kind of current mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, kind of Berkshire Hathaway CEO Warren Buffett, who was kind of in the news for some notable comments about the economy, and then kind of actor Alec Baldwin, who was prominent on kind of 30 Rock and had some ruminations about maybe or maybe not running for mayor of kind of New York City, just as some sense of kind of, if we gave them this range of candidates, how might possibly the effect of what that means, how would the support for a third-party candidate depend upon once nailing down and kind of giving some actual structure to what that might mean. And what you see is that, not surprisingly, right, once you start filling in what a qualified independent might mean, kind of the results are a little bit less supportive of a third-party candidate. But again, there's no context with these names, right? So the kind of people have no idea of what they would actually do in office other than kind of what they're attributing to them. But nonetheless, you'd see kind of Michael Bloomberg, right, would still pull 14% of Tennesseans would vote for Michael Bloomberg over Obama or kind of Romney. 18% would vote for Warren Buffett. And surprisingly, I think, 8% would kind of vote for kind of Alec Baldwin in the state of Tennessee, which kind of is kind of humorous and kind of silly. But on the other hand, it kind of shows that there is this kind of level of kind of discontent in terms of kind of what's going on, in terms of, people are willing to say they'd vote for a Hollywood actor for kind of, president, even without knowing anything kind of about what his actual kind of positions would be. And so I think that it's kind of interesting that it kind of illustrates, without any kind of context, and again, it's very hypothetical, and what it actually means for an actual election is a bit unclear for all kinds of reasons, but you can still see that there's not a whole lot of there is a surprisingly large number of kind of people who are kind of unsatisfied with what's going on and kind of a little bit malleable in kind of their opinions that they're expressing on such public opinion polls.
Thanks very much. Larry, would you like to pick it up and go from there?
Yes, thanks. As both Elliot and Josh have said, there's a great deal of public dissatisfaction with the system, and so discussions of the kind that we're having today I think are very welcome. But as the contrarian on the panel, I have to say that if this particular project actually gets off the ground and sweeps the country, the results are likely to be quite counterproductive. And I think the reasons have to do with the fundamental difficulty of the problem that we're trying to solve here. Basically, we expect a lot of an electoral process, which is really a very blunt instrument. In a system like ours, where elections are decided by pluralities, it really is hard for voters to convey much more information other than this guy or that guy, a yes or a no, a dichotomous choice of some sort. And really the logic of the two-party system stems almost entirely from that simple fact about the electoral process we have. So how would the process that we're talking about today get around that problem? I think we're thinking about three potential difficulties, all of which have to do with the slogan, picking a president rather than a party. The first is how we settle on a nominee. If there are two candidates to choose from for the nomination, that's simple. You just have a majority vote and one or the other gets a majority. If there are more than two candidates, then the outcome of the election turns out to depend in very complicated ways on the particular set of candidates that are available and on the particular process that you use to narrow things down to the final one. If you just, for example, had a vote among 500 people who were potential candidates, the winner might have 1% of the vote. That person might or might not be as popular as the other 499 people that were running. And indeed, as the set of candidates gets large, the probability that any of the candidates will command a majority of support against each of the others goes to zero. Just as a mathematical fact, it's not going to be the case that whoever wins this nomination will have the support of a majority of people, even who participated in the process, much less of the public as a whole. Now, that's a problem with the nominating processes that the existing parties already have as well. How do they solve it? Well, they solve it badly, but insofar as they solve it at all, they do it through this sequential process that gradually winnows the field down until at the end, at least some substantial number of primary voters have a choice between two credible candidates. And the person who ends up winning the nomination is often, at least arguably, the most preferred person that that party can put forward. So, for example, in 2008, the Democrats had a long kind of grinding contest, which eventually got down to Obama versus Clinton. A lot of Democrats weighed in on that, and eventually it became clear that Obama had more support than Clinton did among Democrats. How that kind of process would work in this online forum is quite unclear, and I think it would be unlikely to work in a way where the winning candidate could credibly claim to have the majority support of the people who participated in the process. Then you get that person goes into the general election against the two major parties' candidates, and again, voters are faced with this very difficult problem of trying to figure out how to use a plurality election to convey support for one of three, or in fact actually more than three, since there are lots of other people who will be on the ballot as well, candidates in a race. As long as the minor candidates really are minor, people vote for them knowing that it's only for symbolic purposes, that's fine. But if one of these third candidates, as might be the case with this process, seems to have enough support that he could actually, or she could actually win a plurality, then every voter faces very complicated strategic considerations about whether to vote for the person that they most prefer or whether to vote in a way that forestalls electing the person that they least prefer. And those calculations depend in complicated ways on expectations about how much support each candidate will have, which will themselves likely be very fluid because this process will be brand new and the candidates will be people, at least potentially, who aren't very well known to much of the American public. So the likely outcome is that voters supporting this third-party candidate will be increasing the likelihood of electing the major party candidate that they least like. And then finally, if this third-party candidate was in fact elected president, he or she would be a president without a party. what would that person do once they were in the White House? They wouldn't be able to draw on the support of Democrats or Republicans in Congress. I think the most likely outcome would be policy gridlock on a scale much larger and more severe than the policy gridlock that we see right now. That's a function of the way the party system works within Congress, which itself has to do a lot with the institutions of American government. The real problem of gridlock, I think, has much less to do with the way the parties are organized than it does with the way our institutions of government are organized. If we had a parliamentary system in which either the Democrats or the Republicans had a majority in Congress, and a majority in Congress was enough to implement their policies, they would implement their policies. We wouldn't have gridlock. The reason we have gridlock is that we have divided government, separation of powers, and the president has only in some cases a very tenuous impact on the policy-making process. If that's true of a president who's come up through the ranks of one of the existing parties and has a lot of partisan support to draw on in Congress, it'll be much more true of a president who's elected by this system that sets out to be independent of the parties and doesn't, the person who gets elected doesn't owe anything to the party members in Congress or vice versa. So it's going to be difficult to make it work. If it does work, it's going to create problems in the general election. And if we somehow manage to elect someone this way, I think it would be disaster from the point of policymaking.
Well, that's enough. That's an uplifting point of view, Larry.
But I'm glad we're talking about it.
Liz, you want to give us a comparative analysis from south of the border?
That's right. So I'm Liz Zechmeister, and one of the things I do at Vanderbilt is I'm Associate Director of the Latin American Public Opinion Project, which as one of its major projects carries out the Americas Barometer, which is a survey of the Americas, national surveys, 26 countries in the Americas, with the last round completed in 2010. So I thought what I would do is take my time to try to put some of this in a comparative context to offer some perspective on how people in the US seem to feel and act with respect to politics in comparison to people in the Latin American and Caribbean region. So just to start with some similarities, when we look across the region, and I've been looking at the 2010 Americas Barometer data, we see that levels of trust in political parties are low across the region, right? So this is some similarities. At this point in time, people across the Americas don't trust political parties. That said, you might find it interesting that when you consider 26 countries across the Americas, only in 3 countries, Argentina, Ecuador, and Trinidad and Tobago, at the top of all your minds, do we find average levels of of trust in political parties lower than we find in the United States. So comparatively, levels of trust in political parties in the US are low. What explains these low levels of trust in political parties across the Americas? Well, it won't surprise you that one of the best predictors of trust in political parties are economic evaluations. So when we look at people's evaluations of the general state of the economy or of their own household situations, we find both in the Latin American and Caribbean region and in the US, these factors predict negatively support for or trust in political parties. So we see some similarities when we look across the region, but we also see some differences, and I thought I would just comment on 2, again, just for the sake of putting this in a broader perspective. And the 2 that I want to comment on are diffuse political support and party system institutionalization. So for the students out there, you may have read in one of the political science courses here at Vanderbilt some scholarship by David Easton. And David Easton is one of the scholars who's responsible for giving us this concept of diffuse political support. He distinguishes diffuse political support from specific political support. And generally in the literature, when we think of specific political support, we think of support for actual actors, politicians in office. And when we think of diffuse political support, we think of support for the political system or the party system more generally, right? And what Easton's framework gave us the notion of is that there are reservoirs of goodwill, in his terms, that build up for these things over time. And if you allow a system to function for a long time like it has in the US, you develop very deep reservoirs of goodwill toward the system in general, toward Democratic Party politics, right? And so when we contrast the US with Latin America and the Caribbean region, what we find is that in the US we have a very stable, old two-party system where reservoirs of diffuse support have built up over time and are hard to sink to very low levels. And in Latin America, we have systems that are generally, on average, younger, have experienced more interruptions. And in general, we think that reservoirs of diffuse support are weaker, are shallower, right? More subject to decay. And so what this means for us is that whereas economic dissatisfaction or political discontent here in the US may translate into movements like the one we're talking about today, scholars of democratic politics in Latin America tend to worry that political dissatisfaction, either because of poor economic output, corruption, crime problems, or other factors, will translate into a loss of support for democracy itself. Okay? So can we look at any data that shows this to be the case? Well, when we consider the public opinion data from the Americas Barometer, on average across numerous indicators, we see that we find broader support for the democratic political system, for democracy, and for the basic rules of the democratic game. We find that broader diffuse support to be greater in the United States than it is in most countries in Latin America and the Caribbean region. So what does that mean in numbers? Just for example, the belief that the Army should be allowed to shut down the executive office is not widely supported in the United States. You should all feel good about that. But in contrast, in Mexico, Guatemala, and El Salvador, over 50% of respondents to a national survey report that they think the military would be justified in shutting down government in cases of high corruption. So that's what I mean by a lack of broad support for the political system. And if you think that these attitudes are simply frustrations expressed in survey data, I could talk later over that drink in the lobby about the recent case in Honduras in 2009 when the military escorted the elected president out of office over to Costa Rica after the elected president proposed a non-binding plebiscite to consider issues of constitutional reform, of political reform. The second factor that I wanted to mention was the institutionalization of the party system. So again, as I said, in general, across the Latin American and Caribbean region, parties and party systems are younger than the comparative old age of the two main parties in the US. And what that means is that affective ties to parties in the US tend to be stronger than in Latin America, where party switching by voters, but also by politicians who will trade party labels, is more common. The comparative youth of the current party systems in Latin America also means that the very basic rules of the game are still being ironed out. So among the many political reforms that have been discussed in Latin America in recent years, there have been policy debates and reforms with respect to quotas for female candidates, changes to the compulsory or voluntary nature of voting, term limits, among others. But these lower levels of commitment to political parties also seem to be associated with greater electoral volatility in the Latin American region, not only in the sense that the vote share for any one party will switch significantly from one election to another, but also in the sense that new parties form more easily and have successfully competed for office in recent times. And while those shallow attachments to political parties may allow for some desirable flexibility in the party system, some flexibility that some people in the audience might be looking for in the US, they also tend to, in particular when in the context of economic or other crises, economic crisis, security crisis, political crisis, or all three, as we've seen in Latin America, they tend to have, in some cases, fueled the near complete disintegration of the traditional political party system. And two examples from recent memory in Latin America are the administrations of Alberto Fujimori in Peru and current President Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. These are political outsiders who came to power in times of discontent in weakly institutionalized parties where people were looking for a third option. They supported a political outsider untethered to a political party into office, and that person then sort of ran roughshod over traditional political processes, checks and balances, and so on. Well, not all crises in Latin America do lead to radical changes in the party system, but the low level of party institutionalization and weak diffuse support for the traditional system seem to allow for comparatively more significant changes to take place So in contexts where the rules of the game are not quite settled and loyalties to the democratic system itself are comparatively weak, crises can destabilize politics, and attempts to tinker with the rules of the game can lead to crises. And I hope that maybe puts tonight's discussion into some comparative perspective.
John, before you go ahead, I think when you finish, I have a couple of 3 questions, Elliot, that a snotty journalist would ordinarily be expected to ask. None that you haven't heard before. And then maybe we'll have a little conversation and go to the audience. But John Geer.
Thank you, John. And like Larry and Liz and others have said, just the opportunity to have this conversation, obviously, Elliot came to my class earlier today, and that was a great opportunity for the students and for myself as well. And I thought I'd start with a little bit of context as well, but from a different point of view, and more of an historical context within the United States. And what I mean by that is that the efforts that Elliot and Peter and the entire American Elects group is doing is something that actually has happened lots of times in a way in American history. And what I mean by that is that the nominating process itself has always been contested because who gets to control the nominating process controls a huge amount of power. Boss Tweed, a famous city boss of the late 1800s, he famously said, "I don't care who does the electing, just so I get to do the nominating." And what he meant by that is that if he could control the party, he could in fact control the political process. And so all the time there's been unhappiness. So for example, in the early part of this country's history, the Congressional Caucus actually nominated presidents. It did it so in a kind of a bizarre way. But people became unhappy with that process. Why? Because they were choosing candidates who people didn't necessarily like. And so there was a reform in the development of the caucus, and the convention system arose. Well, the convention system started to choose people that lots of individuals didn't like, who felt excluded from the process. And so Woodrow Wilson and other individuals, La Follette from Wisconsin, made calls for direct primaries to open up the process. In fact, in each of the reform cases, including this one, there is an effort to call, and I think correctly so, to make it more democratic, to make it more open. So that you had the direct primary come about starting in the very early 1900s. That new system didn't work very well, and so then you had a lot of unhappiness, especially centered around 1968. And the McGovern-Fraser Commission came, which empowered primaries to have even more of a say. And then new unhappinesses arose. So every time, because the nominating process is so important, because it shapes our choice down to 2, there's going to be unhappiness. So that those people who favored Barack Obama in 2008 thought the process was pretty good. People who liked Hillary Clinton, they may have had some problems with it. So it's always important to know and to note that democratization has been unfolding in the process. Complaints have been going on from the beginning of this country because it matters so much. And so what is going on in this organization is part and parcel of a very democratic and a very American kind of process. And from that point of view, it's a good thing whether you like it or you dislike it. I'm not going to quite be the contrarian that Larry is, but I want to raise a couple of thoughts about this before we kind of have John ask his questions. One is that a lot of this discussion and a lot of this proposal is based fundamentally on an unhappiness with polarization in the political process. We have a polarized political process. We have the Democrats on one side, the Republicans on the other. We have blue states, we have red states. We have incivility in the process. People are unhappy with it. I can remember very clearly in around 1980, people were so unhappy because the parties agreed so much. I think George Wallace said it pretty famously, there's not a dime's worth of difference between the parties. People complained about that. Well, now we have a choice, and people are complaining again. And so one thing about a democracy that's a good thing is people constantly complain. And as myself being a fan of negativity, I'm all in favor of that. But we have to realize that there's always going to be unhappiness. And so because there's choices being made and how we aggregate those choices are difficult, but this polarization that people are currently unhappy with, if we went away with it and we had this happy middle, I'm not so sure that people would be happy. We'd be complaining about something else. And in general, this pattern of unhappiness extends right now. For example, we have 9% popularity or approval of Congress. We have a pretty unpopular president. None of the Republican contenders seem particularly exciting. That there's this dissatisfaction with the leadership in this country. And we have a news media that's constantly reminding us about that. And what I wanted to point out is that there's a lot of unhappiness about why we don't have enough good leaders. And there are op-ed pieces constantly written on this and short essays of various sorts. And there was actually one political commentator recently, or I recently came across this, identified 5 things for why we don't have very good leaders. Because, of course, part of the unhappiness here is tied to Barack Obama, or tied to the fact that Romney's a flip-flopper, or that Newt Gingrich is Newt. I need not say more, I think, or dare not. So here's some by this piece that I came across. One complaint about political leadership is that the best talent in this country goes into the private sector. We have a vibrant business community. You can make more money. In fact, we certainly can make more money working for FedEx than you probably can working for a state legislature. So our best talent goes in the private sector. Second, Congress is an institution not developed with the idea of grooming people, for example, for high leadership, to be president. That it's an institution that really doesn't make that a very good move. Second, third, that the party system nominates bad choices, that they never nominate the exciting candidates who can really govern effectively. And so there's just unhappiness with the party system. The Electoral College, a constant complaint, and those of us from Tennessee, knowing that we could have had President Gore, obviously have lots of unhappiness with the Electoral College, but it does give candidates from small states a bit of a disadvantage. People from larger states have an advantage. This person mentioned this. And then 5, that there are obviously significant biases in the process because, for example, people's religion, such as Romney being Mormon, obviously gender, ethnicity. There's a lot of things that keep people out of the office of the president. For example, we've only had basically white males, Protestants. There's been a few exceptions, obviously Kennedy, but for the most part, it's been a very select few. And so all of this is an example of why we don't have very good leaders. Sounds reasonable, sounds credible. This was written in 1895 by James Bryce, a pretty famous political commentator. And I raise this only to point out that we are always about unhappiness, always about trying to become better, always concerned about the process. Right now, as the data that Elliot suggested, yeah, it's a little higher. It's a lot higher. And so we should have these conversations, but in the larger sweep of things, it's what a democracy is about, and in fact, nothing to get particularly worried about, especially when you put it in the kind of perspective that Liz just gave us, because still the rock solid, there's still rock solid support here in a lot of different ways for the core institutions. It is not nearly as potentially unsettled as the case in lots of Latin America, lots of Latin American countries. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to my friend, John.
Thank you very much, John. Elliot, let me begin with an obvious question. A great part of the discontent that we've all talked about has to do with money in politics. It's been said that Americans elect will need $30 million to carry this project forward. I've read that something over $22 million already has been raised. Transparency in government, big issue. Many people concerned about it. Nobody knows who gave the $22 million, who will give the $30 million. As I understand it, no one will be allowed to give more than $10,000. Mm-hmm. Still a big chunk for an awful lot of people in this country. How do you defend the lack of transparency?
Well, let's talk about what's getting funded.
Sure.
The only thing that's getting funded at Americans Elect is the $15 million it takes to get on the ballot, which the Democratic and Republican parties both get for free. So that's that one barrier to entry right there. And it's our website, a platform that people can come to. So we don't give a cent to any candidate. We don't give a cent to advocating for any specific issue. All of the candidates that come to Americans Elect will disclose the same way every candidate discloses through the Federal Election Commission, and they'll run that way. And if you look at our site right now, you can see we have our audited financials up there. You can see how every penny has been spent, which is, as I mentioned, on 50 state ballot access and on this website, as well as our tax form 990. Quite frankly, it's probably no surprise to anybody here that what we're doing is fundamentally unpopular with the Republican and Democratic Party. We are doing something that has the potential to greatly shift the status quo. A number of our donors have come forward and disclosed the individuals, not donors, but the individuals who provided the seed loans for this, because all of the initial seed money for this was structured as loans, so it could be paid back when we actually had a platform where we could solicit folks for donations, and right now we have over 4,000 individuals who's given, and we have a, if you go on our site right now, you'll see an active giving stream of people who are making small donations and writing why they're making small donations to Americans Elect. But quite frankly, like any small business, you got to go somewhere to raise the seed money, and we structured that as loans, and many of those folks have disclosed. Peter Ackerman, who's sitting there right there, has disclosed that he's given
Peter Ackerman, we're glad
some of the
you're here.
seed money
Thank
to
you
this.
so much.
So listen, you got to start somewhere. We are doing something that challenges the status quo. A lot of these individuals are going to come out at their own pace, but they're individuals who right
Well,
now
let me just
it's
push it
difficult for
one
them.
step.
Push.
Wouldn't transparency build more confidence in the reform movement you're heading?
I think,
I
listen,
mean,
if-
you know, it's fine for me to say I gave you 10 grand, and here's who I am. But for an awful lot of people, there's a question about, well, who gave 22 million and who's going to give 30 million, because many of those people are not coming forward.
Right.
Is there any reason why it would not be better to have full disclosure and to have complete transparency?
in this political climate right now, a lot of those individuals have said that that they're getting behind this and will come forward at their own pace because it's very difficult for them. Perhaps if they're an individual who is prominent in public life in the party system, if they're an individual who holds a position of public leadership with a publicly traded company, might be something that's difficult for their shareholders to get behind. They have to have that space. You know, we can talk about it. Let's, like for instance, Occupy Wall Street right now. You know, they have $500,000 sitting in a 501c4. You know, the individuals who are participating in that aren't disclosed as well because they're afforded certain protections to basically stand up against the status quo, and that's what's going on. That's what's going on here. I think it's great that folks are coming forward to say that they support Americans Elect. A lot more are coming forward every single day, and you can see them on our site. But again, you know, this comes down to two things: 50-state ballot access and a platform that people can come to, and you can see how every single cent that we've raised has been spent.
Well, let me just end it with can you envision it when it's over, however it turns out, that full disclosure will be made?
I think at the end of the day, all these people are going to want to stand up and proudly say that they supported this in its infancy.
Let me take you in another direction, just for a moment.
Please.
I've heard you say, read that you said, and watched you, I guess, on YouTube, say, you know, it's time for us to take it away from political voices, the far left, political voices, far right, and to focus on the center. We don't have an ideology, but isn't focusing on the center suggesting that the candidate that emerges from this process will be a, quote, moderate, as opposed to a candidate to the left or the right?
Yeah, I don't think there's a the hunger that we're seeing right now isn't for a moderate or a centrist or a new position on the two-dimensional spectrum. You know, our country's facing real challenges right now, and what we've seen play out over the last year is the continued and predictable failure of our government to put forward any type of real solutions. We saw it last week before Thanksgiving with the failure of the super committee. We saw it over the summer with the failure in the debt talks, and we saw it all the way back in April with the failure to pass the budget, and we're about to see it probably again in December when we have to pass another budget, or at least a continuing resolution. So it's not the hunger for some type of centrist position, it's the hunger for stable solutions. So if you can show me a piece of legislation, if you look at all the major pieces of social legislation, whether it be the highway bill, Social Security, Medicaid, those were all, or Medicare, those were all passed with a majority of the minority. So show me legislation that 65 senators and 330 members of Congress can get behind, and I'll be for that. And when we look at those major pieces of social legislation, you know, they weren't passed by a bunch of centrists, they were passed by a bunch of Republicans and Democrats. But those are Republicans and Democrats who figured how to govern. And that governance comes where people can defect and work with each other. And that political space just does not exist right now.
Just one final question, and then we'll go to others on the panel, because they may have questions or comments. And then we'll go to you. You've said, and I think it's right, if you're successful in this reform movement, it'll virtually ensure 2 minority parties. What's the advantage of having 3 minority parties?
Well, first of all, I'll say it again. We are not a third party. I think we need to make that clear right now. The ticket that comes out of this can be a Republican. The ticket that comes out of this is a Republican running with an independent, which, let's remember, we almost saw last cycle when Senator McCain said he wanted to run with Senator Lieberman. That individual would be the President of the United States and a Republican. So, we have a two-party system that served us well for many, many years. It's not serving us well right now as we're not seeing those solutions come forward. So we're looking at two parties right now that seem to be less and less representative of the American people. The majority of our electorate right now, 44% of Americans, self-identify as independents. Now, they're not some complete homogeneous entity, but they're folks who feel disenfranchised by the positions that the two parties are sitting on. Actually, if you come to our site right now, you'll see we've had, as I mentioned, 13 million questions answered. The demographic of the people that are answering those questions are twofold. They're folks who are conservative on fiscal issues, and the economy is weighted as our #1 issue. And they're folks who are socially more tolerant when it comes to the other issues, specifically, social issues, things like abortion rights, gun rights, things of that nature. So those are people who don't have a political home as the ideology of the two major parties have staked their ground. And these are basically disenfranchised Americans. So what this is about is really providing a magnet in our political space that disincentivizes the polarization of the two parties and creates a more robust competition in the areas where we actually do have political overlap, and those are the areas where governance occurs.
One last question, and then we'll go. From Teddy Roosevelt to Ross Perot, we've had third-party candidates. Do you have a vision that this could produce a president of the United States?
Absolutely. If you look at the polling right now, there is a Mack truck gap with frustration that exists in this space with the Americans who are not sitting out here or sitting out here on the spectrum. We're not Americans elect. We're not running the candidate. And again, we're not a third party. But what we are doing is removing the barrier to entry so that a candidate can emerge and run authentically. And what I mean by authentically is, to stand up there on the stage in a presidential debate, and I think I mentioned it to your class this morning, and when you have on the one side in the debate a Republican candidate arguing till he is blue in the face that I will not, as we saw recently, I will not take a deal that is 10-to-1 tax cuts versus spending. And then you have on the other side President Obama explaining that, well, I've come up with a plan that's a reduction of $3 trillion in the debt over 10 years. And that plan is, well, we're not going to spend $1.5 trillion on our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan over the next 10 years. Well, that's not really cuts. We know we're not going to be spending that amount of money, and that interest rates are going to stay the same over 10 years, which nobody can predict. And somebody who can look at both of these people and say, neither of these folks are serious. And maybe I'm a Republican, maybe I'm a Democrat, but maybe I'm an independent. But all we're doing in Americans Elect is creating the political space so someone can actually get on that stage and put that message forward. And let's see the type of traction that message gets, especially in this cycle where we are seeing, as I mentioned, the continual and predictable failure of our leaders to actually govern.
Let me ask the two contrarians, are the other two members of the panel, you want to weigh in here?
Well, let me follow up on a question that comes from Larry more than myself, and Larry can adjust it or veto it. You're assuming this candidate that comes out, you're really assuming this candidate's going to be moderate. But given the kinds of arguments that Larry just made, it could spin off into the left or to the right. And so the person you're envisioning isn't at all a sure thing.
Well, the ticket that we have is a nonpartisan ticket. So it has to be a Republican with a Democrat, Democrat with an independent, and ultimately...
But if the president himself, the main person's a strong Republican, let's say right-wing Republican or a left-wing Democrat, the vice president matters only, that role can matter a lot or it can matter very little, obviously, depending on the health of the president. So
I think John McCain would probably take issue with that as he's sitting in the Senate. Some would say based off of his VP choice.
Well, it can matter as far as your electability, but I'm talking about governing. That is, that you wouldn't, let's say that person manages to get in because you combine, the Sarah Palin runs with Barney Frank. That would be entertaining. But I'm not sure.
That's what would be.
That ticket, first of all, it's the hijacked argument. How does this not necessarily get hijacked?
Well, it's not even necessarily hijacked. I'll let Larry follow up on, because it doesn't even need to be intentional, right? In the sense of aggregation of the preferences.
Well, I like the way you said it, that there's this space of people who are conservative on fiscal issues and more liberal on social issues who feel dissatisfied with the current two-party system. But if there are at least two issues, there's going to be some set of people who have a combination at any point that is not the two combinations that are represented by the existing parties who are going to be unhappy. So if this space created a party that was, or moved one of the existing parties in a direction that was more fiscally conservative and socially liberal, it would leave behind another big set of people who are satisfied with where the party is now but would be dissatisfied with it in its new location. There isn't any way that two parties can cover the full spectrum of preferences that people have in a complex society.
Right. Well, I mean, everything that we're talking about needs to be presupposed with the idea that the individuals who are running are going to run and try to run competitively. So if I'm Sarah Palin, I look at this and I look at everything that I stand for in terms of my ideology, and I say, and to do this, I have to run with Barney Frank, to use that example. I can't win running with Barney Frank. Barney Frank negates everything that I stand for. What it does is, what we're doing is basically re-looking at the incentive structure as it exists right now in our politics and how we nominate, which is what's very important. Because right now in our nomination process, the incentive lies in being on the far right or the far left to win the nomination. I mean, we all have seen it cycle after cycle. The candidates have to go like this, and they have for the nomination, and then they have to come back in. By changing that incentive structure and having enough political space where forming a nonpartisan ticket is rewarded, you allow a ticket to run authentically throughout this process. We're creating that political space, and this didn't come up, but in our convention, there's no reason why a Barack Obama or the Republican nominee, if they wanted to capture this constituency, could sweep in and say, I'm going to run through Americans Elect. Barack Obama picks an independent, or a Republican. Same thing on the Republican side, and they say, I'm going to compete for this constituency. Fundamentally, what we're doing is creating competition in this space where right now there is no competition. So if that individual decides they want to compete for this constituency, which right now really goes unrepresented, they could compete for it and they could win, and we would, in effect, become less relevant. You would see Barack Obama or the Republican twice. However, if they decide they want to ignore this constituency, this 44% of independent voters, and force them to, choose, as David Brooks says, one of the moon parties, the minority parties as they exist, then we'll see how that constituency reacts.
Liz, Josh, weigh in. I don't. This is the First Amendment Center, after all. You can speak or not speak.
I'll ask a question, not as a comparativist, but just as an ordinary citizen looking at this. So, I mean, one of the things that this seems to be a great thing for is increasing people's voice in the political process. But I wonder about the limitations of using a mostly online format, at least in this stage in the process, to achieving that goal. I was just reading in the New York Times the other day that 41% of Mexican Americans are dropping out of high school in New York City. These individuals are probably not on your website. Mm-hmm. They may be on the internet, so when you look at internet numbers, and if you just want to say, well, most Americans are on the internet, they're on iTunes or they're on, whatever they're on, I don't know, things that I'm not. And so how are they brought into this process if it's about increasing the voice of the people in the process?
Sure. So obviously, there's the issue of, okay, so who has access to a nice MacBook Air in their living room with wireless? And obviously, that's not everybody. But when you whittle that down, people who have access to public libraries, because there are computers in public libraries with internet access. People who have cell phones. You see, when you look at cell phones and libraries, those numbers get up to north of 80% of individuals who actually have that. And folks will be able to use their cell phone. They have a smartphone to get engaged with this technology. But listen, I'm not going to sit up here and say that it's 100% of Americans are going to have this immediate access. And when we get to voting, we'll be pushing out to our volunteers to get folks involved, get the word out that people can vote this way. But you said 41%?
Of Mexican Americans dropping out.
41% of Americans also don't live in Iowa. So if you're an American, most Americans don't get to participate in a primary in a meaningful way. If you're not a member of, right now, if you're not a member of the party, you don't live in an early primary state. Let's say you live in California, for instance, which their primary just got moved to June. In all likelihood, folks in California aren't really going to get to participate in a meaningful way this primary cycle. I'm a resident of the District of Columbia. I don't get to participate in a meaningful way. But the fact that we could increase voter franchise, invite every registered voter to participate in a competition where it is one voter one vote, I think is allowing a lot more people into the process. You know, and to your point, John, it is actually a natural progression in how we look at the way we've been nominating our leaders, which has always been trending towards more inclusion. You know, a little bit of inside baseball is 2012 will be the 100th anniversary of the political primary. The first one was held in 1912. So, and then we saw binding primaries come about later on. But the trend has always been, you know, from the days where, you know, it was settled in Congress and then behind closed doors to one of more and more voter participation and voter franchise. And, you know, aside from, you know, the game theory behind what we've discussed about a nonpartisan ticket, this is also just about the fact that of getting more American voters engaged in a process. And if we have more participation, we're going to wind up with better results.
Josh?
Yeah, so just building on some of the things that have been talked about. So one thing that we find in the poll, for example, is that when you give a third-party candidate, like Romney support craters, and so now you basically have his support going to largely the third-party candidate for whatever reasons. And so given that we're in a winner-takes-all system with Electoral College, you know, and given that there's voters are going to be confronted potentially with this very complicated, I mean, it's almost like an assurance game. I mean, if you're someone who's kind of attracted by this ticket, the fear that you have is if you vote for the ticket, right, your least favorite candidate could kind of take the election. So how do you are able to kind of convince voters that that's something they could kind of buy on in terms of taking that particular risk? And
yeah, I think it's tough. I mean, you mentioned your polling. It's tough to talk about when we're sitting here in the hypothetical, and you know, but that's where we're at right now on the calendar. Is the candidates are only starting to emerge, and all of the fields, you know, seem, you know, obviously except for the Democratic field, seem very fluid. You know, as I think, you know, we were talking about earlier, that when you took the poll, Herman Cain was the leader, and now it looks like, you know, his days, he might be pulling out here pretty soon. But, you know, all that being said, I mean, if we look at one recent example where this really played all the way through, it's the '92 election with Perot. And a lot of folks, and Perot was a candidate who kind of exists in this space where there was a lot of overlap with his positions. And, you know, if you look at Perot's campaign, all the exit polls, there's sort of this misnomer that, well, Perot spoiled the election for H.W. Bush. If you look at the exit polls, it's quite different. 38% of the people who voted for Bill Clinton, or voted for Perot, said they would have voted for Clinton. 38% said they would have voted for Bush. And the last 24% said if Perot hadn't been on the ballot, they wouldn't have voted at all. So, I mean, Perot didn't spoil it for anybody. So if you look at that, you know, having that candidate who exists somewhere in this place of overlap, you know, it's just extremely difficult to predict what that is, especially when you don't have a candidate. And if I brought up this anecdote in your class, but I really liked it, was I was out in a meeting a few weeks ago with a woman, and we were talking about this, and you know, was a prominent Obama supporter, and she basically said, you know, so I really love what you guys are doing. I love that you're getting more people involved. You know, I believe there should be more competition in our politics right now, and it definitely seems that the parties have really have a cinch on the nomination. But I just tell you, I'm having a really hard time getting behind this, because I just don't see how if a huntsman runs with a Hillary Clinton, this doesn't spoil it for President Obama. And the point I made to her is, you know, ma'am, if Huntsman runs with Hillary Clinton, they win. I mean, to a certain degree, you know, when we look at the numbers, when we look where the electorate is right now, and if we remove our partisan glasses, and in some respects we remove what is our pattern recognition of what's happened in the last 20 to 30 years, I can think of a number of tickets, I'm sure you could right now, that if they were to emerge in the political space and have a sense that they could win, they would run, and if they did run, that they would win. So let's introduce the competition, and I think we'll see a very interesting, and what could be a very healthy result.
Are there questions out there? Yes. I don't know if we have mics, and we don't have, you just speak up.
Yeah, I have a question about the logistics of this all. First of all, is the nominating commission going to be sort of like a...
We do have a mic coming over, on the way. You just give it a second. Or a couple of seconds.
Yeah, on the nominating convention, is it going to be sort of like a NBA-style bracket where you sort of slowly get eroded out if you don't have enough support? And second, who arbitrates partisanship? You know, you need a Democrat or independent. I'm in Tennessee. I could be a Democrat today, a Republican tomorrow, independent whenever it suits. So, who decides whether or not that is a balanced ticket?
Sure. We have a rules-based convention. If you look, our rules are on up on our site. But specifically, we have two major rounds of voting. One is a qualifying round that takes whatever the larger field of candidates and draft candidates is and reduces it down to 6 candidates. They then pick their running mates, and we go into another round of voting that takes those 6 down to the final candidate that will emerge for Americans Elect. I could get into greater detail, but you can see it on the site. It's basically it's a winnowing down process, and those votes occur between April and June of next year. And specific to your question about who arbitrates this, if you look in our rules, basically a self-announced Republican running with a Democrat, that ticket is presumed to be balanced. But I think to your point was, what if an independent emerges? How do we determine where they are on the spectrum? And the delegates do it in so much as they have to answer the platform questions of our delegate base. That's why those questions exist, so that the candidates come forward and answer the issues that the delegates are most concerned about.
Question. Here is one. While the mic is moving over, could you speak to the security, online security of the vote?
Absolutely. The individual we have doing this is, in many respects, the perfect guy to be doing it. He was a gentleman named Josh Levine who worked up until 1999 at Morgan Stanley, and then went off on a lark to do something that no one would ever do, which was trade stocks online, and he left to help found E-Trade, and was the chief technology officer from E-Trade from 99 to 2006, and he's overseeing if you've been to our site, the site that you're looking at, and that site is really, I like to say, it's an iceberg. What you see on the surface in terms of the interactivity is really only a small portion of it. It's something that's been built out with bank-level security and something that can accommodate tens of millions of Americans being on it for a single period of voting. That being said, I think there's an important point to bring up too, which is what we're having is an online caucus. So, the technology isn't there to have an online secret ballot where no one is able to go back and make sure that that there was complete integrity during the period of voting. So we're having a caucus. Individuals who vote online will receive confirmation of how that they voted, and we'll be able to go around and audit the entire process to make sure that it was done, without any external mischief. So it's a confidential ballot, but not a purely private ballot, because we need to make sure that as we caucus, that this process has complete and total integrity.
Very good.
I have a two-part question for you. So the first part is, can you define partisan?
Partisan?
Yeah.
Somebody of the party.
Okay. And so then, how does one govern? Effectively govern? If I'm a Republican, I win the American elect ticket. I clearly have an allegiance to the Republican Party. How can I effectively govern without regard to partisan interests? Right.
So if I'm the Americans Elect ticket and I get put on as a Republican, is that the question?
Yeah, sure. If you're just an example, how does one effectively govern without regard to partisan interests as someone who is clearly partisan?
Got it. So 2 parts. I think what we're seeing right now is a real hunger from folks, for individuals, to be able to put the interests of the country ahead of the interests of their party, and that seems to be what's playing out in the country right now, is we don't seem to see any really stable policy solutions coming out of the Congress, and that's obviously the Congress and our government under the leadership of the president as well. But I think it also comes to the point that was raised earlier was, well, let's say you have an individual who, let's say, would be an independent and would be sitting as the chief executive as an independent. How could they run when you have a legislature that would be potentially intransigent with the fact that they were an independent and didn't represent the party? And I think, we've actually seen this play out at the local level. I mean, Rhode Island with Lincoln Chafee, who was an independent, Angus King up in Maine is an independent, who both had partisan legislatures. And they were able to effectively lead their states under those conditions. Also, I mean, if you look at that, even President Obama, and we've seen this practice before, has been able to effectively lead by bringing in significant members of either party into their cabinet to like the famous historical piece, form a team of rivals that can effectively govern. So we've seen precedent for this in our history. So I think there's not only precedent for this, but you could definitely see some effective governance come out of this.
Question. There's one right there.
I was just wondering, is there an agreement, or was there ever a thought about having an agreement where the candidate who wins the nomination agrees to take public funding in the general election?
Right. So actually, the way the rules work when it comes to public funding, there's matching funds, as you all know. And in the past few cycles, the Republican and Democratic candidates have refused matching funds because they've been able to raise money in excess of those funds. The Americans elect candidate would be eligible for matching funds. However, they are eligible for matching funds in proportion to the amount of the popular vote that they get, and they're only eligible for those matching funds after the general election. So it's a little bit of a handicap, but obviously if they know that they're getting however much percentage of the popular vote, you know, they could then take those funds out knowing they would receive the matching funds on the back end.
As a follow-up, do you think that an Americans elect candidate can compete financially with the other two parties in a general election?
Let's talk about that. So we have two campaigns that are rolling out this cycle. Each party is expected to spend $1 billion on their campaign. It's a pretty astronomical amount of money. You know, if you look at the way that where most of that money goes, and if you talk to Mark McKinnon, who's one of our advisors who ran Bush 43's two campaigns, he'll tell you quite frankly a lot of that money gets wasted. It gets wasted in very big TV buys and media buys that aren't particularly effective. If you also look at the way, you know, we're talking about reimagining the way that we nominate a candidate, but if you look at it, there's a lot of space to reimagine the way that we nominate or that you run a presidential campaign. I think these are a couple of instructive statistics. In the 2008 campaign, right, the one that where social media swept Barack Obama into office, 15% of Americans were on a social media site. Today, 62% of Americans use social media. I mean, it's the pace of change, especially when we talk about our technology, has increased exponentially, and the ability for folks to leverage those for things like fundraising has become extremely potent, and organization, quite frankly. So there's the room to run a much more swift and efficient campaign. That's not $1 billion campaign. It's probably still going to number in $350 million, but not quite as significant. So you know, the room exists there for that type of innovation, and I think you're going to see it, and I think it's going to be a positive thing.
Question.
Hi, I read on a Politico article that there's a board of directors that has the ability to override the vote of the delegates for the nomination, and to me that seems like to be in contrast to the idea of furthering democracy. So who is on the board of directors? When can they utilize that ability? Sort of, can you just go into more detail about the board?
Sure. I read the same piece, and it's not accurate as it was. You know, surprise, surprise. If you look at it, you know, we do have committees that are helping guide some of this along. Like for instance, you know, we have a platform of questions committee that's actually meeting today because we have thousands of questions that have been posed, and we're taking the top 20, and in some cases we have to merge many of those questions. You know, we have a candidate certification committee that has to make sure the people that are announcing are constitutionally qualified. Ultimately, what you're going to see on our site is we'll be listing in real time the decisions of the board on all matters, and ultimately our delegates can petition and override the board on these decisions. So we have that built into our rules as well. And there was a second part of your question. I forgot.
Who's on the board?
And who's on the board? I'm sorry. Some of the individuals on the board, we have Irv Hockaday, who was the former CEO of Hallmark Cards, director at Estee Lauder. Christy Todd Whitman, former governor of New Jersey, is on the board. Admiral Dennis Blair, former commander of the Pacific Fleet and Obama's director of national intelligence, is on the board. Those are our external directors, and then the other directors we have are internal folks. He's on the board. And Steve Bosworth, thank you, former ambassador to North Korea. Guy knows something about negotiating. And as well as Khalil Bird, our CEO, and Josh Levine, our Chief Technology Officer, are the internal members of our board. If you also go to our website, you'll see we have a much longer, nearly 100 members of our Board of Advisors, and those are individuals who served in every administration since the Ford administration.
We still have time for a couple more questions. Anybody on the panel has one way in. Here's one right here on the second row.
Hi. I was just wondering, how much political sway do you think that Americans elect is going to have this upcoming election in just a year from now? Because I know I've seen some of your numbers that you've posted up, and there are 300 million Americans. How is the word getting out, and how much influence is this going to have on the actual election? How many people are going to come out for Americans elect?
Sure. Well, you know, we've seen a lot of people come to this idea, to this process right now. But the fact of the matter is you're going to see candidates show up, and those candidates are going to bring a lot of their supporters with them. So I think as you see candidates show up for, I mean, the jewel, which is 50-state ballot access, politicians recognize how significant the barrier to entry is. And when that's something that's offered up, the ability to compete and to still be able to run, you're going to see a lot of individuals want to compete for that, especially as the field continues to get winnowed down. So we're really opening up a much more vibrant process. Right now, we've been laying out what the process is, and we've seen a lot of interest. You know, those numbers are since late July. If you talk to Josh Levine, he'll tell you that the amount of growth that we've seen there is the largest amount of growth he's seen with any technology product in the history of his life in technology, larger than Facebook's initial growth. Now, you know, as Khalil Burt, our CEO, who's a lifelong political operative, will tell you this is politics and all bets are off. But you know, we'll see a lot of people, I think, have come to just this idea, but obviously even more when they can attach a personality to it who they're excited about.
One last question? Yes.
Yeah, I want to congratulate you on what you're doing. I think this is a technological inevitability in our society, and I think you guys are doing it in a very even-handed and deliberate way. So I appreciate your efforts to this point. Two-part question. One, traditional party politics have always balanced tickets. And I think John was saying, you know, the largely symbolic role or limited role of the vice president, Dick Cheney aside, is there, you know, how is this idea, you know, you mentioned kind of this facetious, hyperbolic example of Barney Frank and Sarah Palin being on the same ticket, but really, if you're looking at a more moderate, party-free ticket to oppose the conventional party candidates, why would putting a Democrat and a Republican together and saying that's part and parcel of being on the American Select Ticket a bad thing? You have to work it out. I know even though it would be somewhat largely symbolic, why would that be a bad thing? My other question would be, could you speak just briefly about larger plans on state and local elections? Because that seems to be where this process would really gain enduring traction in the long run.
Sure, thanks for bringing that up. Just to make sure, your first question was why would having a Democrat or a Republican be a bad thing?
No, having two relatively polarized people on the same ticket, why would that be a bad thing?
I don't think it would necessarily be a bad thing if they could work it out in your supposition. I just think, you know, as our conversation was going earlier, you know, I think depending, you know, the Barney Frank, Sarah Palin, because that seems to be our example, I just think it's obviously more difficult for them to work it out, the more polarized they are. To the second part of your question, you know, we haven't really touched on this, but the implications for what we're doing extend past the presidency in 2012, and that the ballot access we're achieving in 2/3 of the states will extend to congressional races as well. The last third, I assure you, is much easier to finish than the 2.9 million signatures we've had to gather. Additionally, if the Americans Elect ticket gets anywhere between 2 to 5% of the popular vote in 45 states, and the last 5 are much easier, they automatically are on the ballot as a major party in 2016. So this is really a first step in this. And also the fact that, you know, if we go to, you know, the Americans Elect ticket running in the White House would be a ticket that got elected on a platform that still exists. So if I am the chief executive and I'm trying to encourage defections across the political space, Americans Elect becomes a powerful tool that, listen, if you think you're going to get your head lopped off for working with me as the president on this issue, because I'm a Republican, maybe you're a Democrat, you know, I beg to differ, and if you're worried about getting primaried per se, that's not necessarily going to happen. I think a great example from recent memory is in 2010 in Delaware, you had the Mike Castle race. You know, Mike Castle, a very well-respected politician, ran against, in the primary against Christy O'Donnell, a woman who had to claim that she wasn't a witch. Right. Mike Castle lost that race in a primary where a small number of Republicans were able to participate. Christy O'Donnell won the nomination, went on to lose in the general election. He, in effect, got primaried. If something like an Americans Elect had existed then, that wouldn't have been a viable option. And what we can offer at the local level is the ability for the nasty verb to get primaried to be removed from our political vocabulary for all times.
John, Liz, Larry, Josh, final comment or question?
Just on this last point, I'm confused about how you'd no longer be able to primary somebody because there was a America's Elect. I didn't get the argument.
Sure. Well, if a Mike Castle were able to run as a Republican through Americans Elect, which had basically that ballot access, and not get knocked out in the primary so he couldn't compete.
So he would have been knocked out of the primary, he wouldn't have the Republican nomination, but he
could-
would be on the ballot as an independent.
Right, as an independent to run, so allowing him to continue to compete.
Which is possible already.
If he were able to get ballot access as an independent, but the barrier to entry would have been removed for him.
Let me ask the last question. Does it bother you at all that this obviously creative and innovative idea might produce a candidate who is a racist, who is homophobic, a candidate that would embarrass the founders of the idea?
No, no, because I have a huge amount of faith that the American people aren't going to elect a racist or a homophobic. The thing that concerns me, quite frankly, is what if we do nothing? We have continued political dysfunction. We continue to have all of the challenges that we're facing as a people, and we do nothing. You know, the only consistent thing that we've seen in our country is that when we as a people, as Americans, face real challenges, whether they be institutional challenges or external challenges, that we figure out how to innovate to get through them. So that's what we're doing at Americans Elect. I mean, we invite folks to join us, and we're doing something about it.
Well, I want to thank this distinguished panel, and I want to thank you, Elliot, and I certainly want to thank your father, Peter Ackerman, a member of your board, and for coming tonight, for sharing this idea. And I'll ask this audience to help me show your appreciation to this distinguished panel. And we can continue this out in the lobby as we leave.